Part 6, Section 1, 1754, A World That Still Made Sense. In 1754, most people living in Britain's American colonies did not believe they were approaching a rupture. Life followed patterns that felt stable and familiar. Farms were planted and harvested according to season. Coastal ports moved goods across the Atlantic. Town meetings addressed local concerns. Churches anchored communities. Families planned their futures within a system they believed would continue largely unchanged. Colonists still thought of themselves as British. That identity mattered. British law provided order. British trade connected the colonies to global markets. British military power offered protection from rival empires. The empire felt distant but legitimate. Authority came from across the ocean, but it was rarely questioned. War, when it came, was expected to follow precedent. European powers fought often. Colonial wars were not new. They were usually limited, distant, and episodic. Colonists contributed militia forces, guarded frontiers, and then returned to ordinary life. Victory or defeat altered trade and territory, but rarely altered identity. In 1754, no one imagined that pattern was about to break. Yet beneath the surface, pressure had been accumulating for years. The interior of North America had become the most contested space in the Atlantic world. Britain and France claimed overlapping territories stretching from the Great Lakes through the Ohio River Valley and down the Mississippi. These claims were not simply lines on maps. They represented trade routes, access to resources, and future settlement. The land was not empty. Indigenous nations had long governed these regions through complex systems of diplomacy, kinship, and territorial understanding. They traded, negotiated, fought, and adapted long before European empires arrived. To them, European powers were newcomers competing for influence rather than rightful owners. British colonists, however, increasingly looked westward. Land along the Atlantic coast was becoming scarce and expensive. Generations overlapped. Younger families found it harder to acquire property. Opportunity appeared to exist beyond the mountains, in regions only partially controlled by imperial authority. Expansion promised independence. Land ownership meant stability, status, and autonomy. It represented escape from crowded coastal settlements and economic dependence. For many colonists, moving west felt not only possible, but inevitable. French authorities saw this movement differently. France had invested heavily in controlling interior trade routes, particularly the fur trade. French influence depended on alliances with indigenous nations and a network of forts that asserted presence without mass settlement. British colonial expansion threatened to overwhelm this system. By the early 1750s, both empires recognized the danger. French forces began strengthening positions in the Ohio River Valley. New forts appeared. Old alliances were strengthened. French commanders believed they were acting defensively, preserving territory already claimed. British colonial leaders viewed the same actions as encroachment. Colonial governments, particularly Virginia, claimed portions of the Ohio Valley through charters and land grants. Speculation companies had invested heavily in future settlement. French fort construction threatened those investments and future expansion. Imperial authorities in London were slow to respond. Communication across the Atlantic took months. European politics demanded attention. Colonial disputes often appeared minor compared to continental concerns. Local leaders were left to manage tensions as best they could. In Virginia, colonial officials decided to act. The response was limited in scope. No one proposed a large military campaign. Instead, a small expedition was organized to assert British claims and deliver a message to French commanders, requesting withdrawal from disputed territory. This mission reflected prevailing assumptions. Disputes were expected to be resolved through demonstration, negotiation, and controlled pressure. Violence was not the objective. War was not yet assumed. A young officer was chosen to lead the expedition. George Washington was in his early 20s. He was ambitious, eager to prove himself, and familiar with frontier conditions. His appointment reflected the structure of colonial defense. Local elites often led militia forces, supported by provincial governments rather than the crown. Washington's mission did not succeed. French commanders rejected British claims and continued fortifying their positions. Both sides increased military presence. Each movement was framed as defensive. Each action heightened tension. By the spring of 1754, the frontier was unstable. Small detachments maneuvered through dense forests. Scouts reported enemy movement. Indigenous allies reassessed loyalties. Diplomacy became strained. Misunderstanding was common. Violence erupted suddenly. In May 1754, Washington's forces encountered a small French detachment. Shots were fired. Several French soldiers were killed. The skirmish was brief, chaotic, and poorly understood by those involved. At the time, it did not feel historic. To those present, it was one incident among many frontier clashes that had occurred over decades. Such encounters had rarely escalated into global war. There was no declaration, no mass mobilization, no immediate sense of consequence. But this encounter mattered. It occurred at a moment when European powers were already tense. Alliances were fragile. Diplomatic patience was thin. News of the clash provided justification for escalation that many leaders already expected. Colonists did not immediately understand what had changed. Most people learned of the incident through delayed reports or rumor. Daily life continued. Fields were worked. Trade persisted. Churches met. The empire still felt intact. Yet the machinery of war had begun to turn. British authorities recognized that control of North America was essential to imperial power. France's presence threatened not only colonial expansion, but Britain's global position. Decisions made in Europe would soon shape lives across the Atlantic. Colonial expectations remained optimistic. Colonists believed that if war expanded, it would follow familiar patterns. Britain would provide leadership and protection. Colonists would contribute manpower and local knowledge. Victory would bring reward, recognition, and security. This belief was sincere. In 1754, colonial loyalty to Britain was strong. British identity was a source of pride, not resentment. Few imagined independence. Fewer still desired it. At the same time, colonists held their own understanding of contribution. They lived on the frontier. They faced danger directly. They believed their sacrifices mattered. They expected respect and consideration in return. This expectation would later prove important, though its consequences were not yet visible. Indigenous nations understood the stakes differently. They recognized that this conflict threatened autonomy more than allegiance. They evaluated alliances based on survival, advantage, and balance of power. European wars had long brought disruption, but this one threatened to reshape the interior permanently. By the end of 1754, clarity had not arrived. No formal declaration of war had yet been issued, but forts were being built, troops were mobilizing, alliances were shifting. The frontier was no longer stable. The relationship between Britain and its colonies had not broken, but it had entered a period of testing. That test began quietly, and in 1754, no one yet understood how deeply the answers would diverge. Part 6, Section 2, 1754, Competing Claims and Frontier Pressure. In 1754, the struggle for North America was not yet a war in the minds of most people living within it. It was a contest of claims. Empires asserted ownership through maps, charters, and treaties drafted thousands of miles away. Colonial governments referenced documents written generations earlier. Land companies relied on legal language that promised future settlement. None of these claims reflected the lived reality of the frontier. On the ground, authority was uncertain. The Ohio River Valley stood at the center of this uncertainty. It was valuable not because it was developed, but because it was not. Rivers connected interior trade to distant markets. Forests provided resources. Paths carved by indigenous nations offered movement and access. Whoever controlled this region shaped the future balance of power in North America. France and Britain understood this. Their approaches, however, were fundamentally different. French strategy emphasized control without settlement. Forts were placed along key routes to secure trade and influence. French officials relied heavily on alliances with indigenous nations, particularly those involved in the fur trade. Presence mattered more than population. British colonial expansion followed a different logic. British settlers moved with families. They cleared land. They built farms, towns, and roads. Settlement created permanence. Once land was occupied, it was difficult to reverse. British claims advanced through population rather than military footprint. These approaches collided. To French authorities, British settlers appeared reckless and destabilizing. To British colonists, French forts represented obstruction and threat. Each side believed it was defending rightful claims. Indigenous nations navigated this rivalry with care. They were not passive observers. They assessed which power best served their interests at any given moment. Alliances shifted. Neutrality was sometimes attempted. Survival required flexibility. European officials often misunderstood this complexity. They interpreted indigenous decisions as loyalty or betrayal rather than strategy. This misunderstanding deepened mistrust and miscalculation. As British settlers pressed westward, tension increased. Traders reported French warnings and patrols. Settlers encountered resistance. Rumors spread of impending conflict. Frontier communities felt exposed, distant from both colonial and imperial protection. Colonial governments faced a dilemma. They lacked the resources of European states but felt responsible for frontier security. Waiting for direction from London risked losing ground. Acting independently risked escalation. Many chose action. Virginia's response in 1754 reflected this pressure. The colony's leadership viewed French forts as a direct threat to economic and territorial interests. Land companies had invested heavily in future settlement. Delay meant loss. Yet colonial authority was limited. Militias were local forces, not professional armies. Supplies were scarce. Coordination between colonies was weak. Each colony guarded its own interests more carefully than collective security. This fragmentation mattered. While British imperial identity was shared, colonial governance was decentralized. Cooperation required negotiation rather than command. Efforts to present a unified front often faltered. The French operated differently. Their forces were smaller but more centralized. Military officers answered directly to imperial command. Indigenous alliances provided local knowledge and mobility. French strategy emphasized containment rather than conquest. This difference created asymmetry. British forces relied on numbers and settlement. French forces relied on positioning and alliance. Each believed the other vulnerable. Frontier encounters reflected this imbalance. Small skirmishes, patrols, and warnings became more frequent. Each side tested limits without declaring intent. These actions increased fear without producing resolution. Communication failures compounded the problem. Messages between colonial officials and imperial authorities crossed the Atlantic slowly. By the time instructions arrived, conditions had often changed. Local commanders were forced to make decisions without guidance. European diplomacy lagged behind colonial reality. In Europe, Britain and France remained formally at peace through much of 1754. Negotiations continued. Alliances were discussed. Yet in North America, violence had already begun. This disconnect created danger. Actions taken on the frontier could trigger responses in Europe, even if they were never intended to do so. Colonial incidents carried imperial consequences. Colonists did not fully grasp this dynamic. They viewed frontier conflict as local, even when it was not. Expectations were shaped by past experience. Previous colonial wars had been limited and manageable. This time was different, though few recognized it. The scale of territory involved, the number of competing interests, and the fragility of alliances made escalation more likely. Yet daily life continued largely unchanged. Frontier communities lived with uncertainty. They fortified homes. They formed patrols. They relied on rumor as much as fact. Protection felt uneven. Confidence in distant authority weakened, though loyalty remained intact. Indigenous nations faced mounting pressure. They were asked to choose sides more decisively. Neutrality became harder to maintain. Each choice carried risk. Aligning with one empire invited retaliation from the other. Many sought to preserve balance. They negotiated, delayed, and adapted. Yet the presence of European forts and settlers reduced flexibility. Space for maneuver shrank. British colonial leaders grew impatient. They viewed hesitation as weakness. Delay risked permanent loss of territory. Confidence in negotiation declined. French commanders held their ground. They believed British expansion threatened the entire interior trade network. Withdrawal would invite settlement and loss of influence. Both sides hardened positions. What had once been a contest of influence became a test of resolve. Still, no one declared war. The absence of formal war did not prevent preparation. Troops were gathered. Supplies stockpiled. Fortifications strengthened. Each side acted defensively while preparing offensively. Colonial society absorbed these pressures unevenly. Urban centers remained focused on trade and politics. Rural areas felt less immediate impact. Frontier settlements bore the brunt of uncertainty and risk. This uneven experience shaped perception. Those far from the frontier viewed conflict abstractly. Those close to it experienced fear and disruption directly. These differences would later influence political response. In 1754, the empire still functioned. Trade flowed. Governance continued. Loyalty endured. Yet beneath this stability, fault lines widened. Competing claims had not been resolved. They had been sharpened. The frontier had become a place where misunderstanding accumulated faster than resolution. And in that space, the possibility of wider war took root. In 1754, violence arrived without clarity. It did not announce itself as war. It did not follow formal declarations or coordinated campaigns. Instead, it emerged through brief encounters, incomplete information, and decisions made under uncertainty. The first shots of the conflict were fired not with certainty, but with assumption. This mattered, because the meaning of violence depends on how it is understood. In 1754, those involved interpreted events through the lens of past experience. That lens distorted what was happening in real time. Frontier violence was not new. Colonists had long lived with sporadic conflict along the edges of settlement. Skirmishes, raids, and reprisals were part of frontier life. They were dangerous, but familiar. They rarely escalated into something larger. So, when violence occurred in 1754, it was not immediately recognized as transformative. The encounter that changed everything was brief and confused. In late May, British colonial forces under George Washington encountered a small French detachment moving through contested territory. The meeting was tense. Neither side fully understood the other's intentions. Communication was limited. Expectations were shaped by fear and rumor rather than verified intelligence. Shots were fired. Several French soldiers were killed. Among them was an officer whose death would later be interpreted differently by each side. The encounter ended quickly. There was no prolonged engagement, no decisive outcome. At the time, it felt inconclusive. To Washington and his men, the skirmish appeared defensive. They believed they had encountered a hostile force operating illegally within British-claimed territory. Action felt justified, even restrained. French authorities saw something else entirely. They viewed the encounter as an ambush carried out against a lawful expedition. The death of a French officer transformed a local incident into an imperial grievance. The meaning of the violence shifted as it moved up the chain of command. This difference in interpretation was critical. Both sides believed they were responding appropriately. Neither believed they had initiated a larger conflict. Each assumed the other would de-escalate once the facts were understood. That assumption proved false. News of the skirmish traveled slowly, but its impact grew as it moved. Reports reached colonial capitals, then imperial authorities. Each retelling added emphasis, stripped nuance, and aligned facts with political interest. What had been a confused encounter became evidence of aggression. In London and Paris, officials evaluated the incident through strategic lenses. North America was no longer peripheral. Control of the continent influenced global trade, naval power, and imperial prestige. The skirmish confirmed fears that rivalry had reached a breaking point. Yet even then, war was not inevitable. Diplomacy continued. Negotiations persisted. Both sides sought advantage without full commitment, but the space for compromise narrowed. On the frontier, conditions deteriorated. Following the skirmish, Washington's forces withdrew to a hastily constructed fort. The position was poorly chosen and poorly supplied. French forces, reinforced and accompanied by indigenous allies, advanced. The ensuing confrontation ended badly for the British. Washington surrendered after a brief engagement. Terms were negotiated under pressure and confusion. Language barriers led to misinterpretation of the surrender document, further complicating perceptions of responsibility. This outcome intensified misunderstanding. British colonists viewed the surrender as unfortunate, but manageable. Losses had occurred before. Recovery seemed possible. The empire still felt strong. French authorities interpreted the sequence of events as confirmation of British aggression. Military response appeared justified. Indigenous nations watched closely. They recognized that European conflict was escalating beyond local disputes. The balance of power was shifting. Alignments would soon carry greater consequence. Many indigenous leaders reassessed strategy. They weighed the risks of alliance against the dangers of isolation. Some strengthened ties with the French, believing French presence less threatening to territorial autonomy. Others sought British favor, anticipating eventual dominance. These decisions were pragmatic, not ideological. Survival, influence, and continuity guided choice. European officials often failed to appreciate this, interpreting indigenous action through simplistic categories of loyalty. Colonial society absorbed the news unevenly. Frontier communities felt exposed. Fear increased. Requests for protection multiplied. Militia activity expanded. Confidence in local leadership was tested. In coastal cities, reaction was muted. Trade continued. Politics dominated attention. The frontier still felt distant. Many assumed the situation would stabilize, as it had before. This divergence in experience mattered. Those closest to violence experienced instability firsthand. Those removed from it viewed conflict abstractly. These differences would later influence political response and unity. Imperial authorities began to mobilize more seriously. Troops were prepared, naval resources considered, planning accelerated. Yet public acknowledgement of full war lagged behind preparation. This lag created confusion. Colonists were asked to contribute resources without a clear explanation of scope. Expectations remained based on previous wars, not on the scale now emerging. Colonial assemblies debated funding and responsibility. They argued over who should pay, who should lead, and how much sacrifice was reasonable. Cooperation was uneven. Each colony protected its own interests. This fragmentation weakened response. Unlike centralized European states, the colonies lacked unified command. Coordination required negotiation rather than authority. Delays compounded risk. British officials noted these weaknesses. They questioned colonial reliability. They assessed colonial governance as inefficient and undisciplined. These assessments would later inform policy decisions. Colonists noticed something else. They observed that British leadership seemed distant and slow to respond. Protection felt uncertain. Sacrifice felt asymmetrical. Yet loyalty endured. This contradiction shaped perception. Colonists believed themselves committed partners, but sensed they were viewed as subordinates. This tension existed before resistance, before rebellion, and before ideology hardened. By the end of 1754, violence had altered the landscape. The frontier was no longer a place of manageable risk. It had become a zone of escalating conflict. Yet formal war had not been declared. The empire still appeared intact. Most people still believed resolution was possible. They expected diplomacy to work. They trusted precedent. They believed the system would correct itself. What they did not yet understand was that the meaning of violence had changed, not because it was larger, but because it was misread. Each side learned a different lesson from the same events. Those lessons would guide decisions for years to come. As 1754 came to a close, uncertainty outweighed fear. The year had brought violence, loss, and instability to the frontier, yet it had not delivered clarity. There was no formal declaration of war, no sweeping mobilization, no clear sense that the world had changed permanently. Instead, people across the British-American colonies tried to understand events using the assumptions they already held. Most believed the situation was temporary. This belief rested on experience. Previous conflicts between European powers had touched the colonies before, often harshly, but rarely irreversibly. War came, war passed, and life resumed. Trade adapted. Authority remained intact. Identity endured. Nothing yet suggested this conflict would be different. Colonists still believed the empire worked. British law remained the foundation of governance. Trade continued to connect the colonies to global markets. The Royal Navy still protected shipping lanes. These systems had not collapsed. They still functioned, even if imperfectly. Loyalty to Britain remained widespread and sincere. Colonists did not question their place within the empire. They argued about policy, responsibility, and defense, but not about belonging. Britain was not viewed as an oppressor, but as a distant authority that occasionally misunderstood colonial conditions. Misunderstanding did not yet equal mistrust. Most colonists believed imperial leaders would correct course once fully informed. Delays were frustrating but expected. Distance explained inefficiency. The system felt slow, not broken. Frontier communities felt differently. Those living near contested territory experienced the conflict directly. Violence had disrupted daily life. Fear was real. Protection felt uneven. Appeals for assistance multiplied. Yet, even among frontier settlers, the expectation was support, not separation. They wanted more troops, more supplies, more coordination. They did not want independence. They wanted the empire to function better. Colonial assemblies debated responsibility. Who should pay for defense? Who should command forces? How much authority should colonial governments exercise independently? These debates reflected structural weakness rather than ideological division. Colonies were accustomed to autonomy in local matters. They raised militias. They funded projects. They governed daily life. Imperial oversight existed, but it was light. This balance had worked reasonably well in peacetime. War strained that balance. Defense required coordination. Coordination required authority. Authority raised questions that had previously been avoided. Still, these questions remained practical, not philosophical. Colonists argued about logistics, not legitimacy. British officials viewed the situation differently. From London, the colonies appeared disorganized and inefficient. Militia forces seemed unreliable. Colonial assemblies appeared reluctant to fund defense adequately. Coordination failures frustrated imperial planners. British leaders interpreted colonial behavior through a lens of discipline and hierarchy. They expected obedience and efficiency. Colonial negotiation and debate appeared as resistance, even when it was not intended as such. This gap in perception widened quietly. Neither side believed the relationship was breaking. Each believed the other simply misunderstood circumstances. Each expected adjustment rather than confrontation. Indigenous nations assessed the year with greater caution. They understood that European conflict was deepening. They recognized that this war threatened to reshape control of the interior permanently. They evaluated alliances carefully, knowing choices made now would have long-term consequences. Some indigenous leaders believed French presence offered greater protection against settlement. Others hedged bets, maintaining limited engagement with both sides. Neutrality remained an option, but a narrowing one. Their calculations were pragmatic. They did not view the conflict as ideological, they viewed it as existential. European officials often failed to grasp this perspective. They assumed allegiance could be commanded or purchased. They underestimated the autonomy and strategy of indigenous decision-making. By the end of 1754, these misunderstandings had not yet produced collapse, but they had begun to accumulate. Colonial society remained divided in experience. Urban centers focused on trade and politics. Frontier communities focused on survival. Coastal elites debated imperial policy. Rural settlers worried about protection. These differences shaped perception. Those removed from violence believed stability remained possible. Those exposed to danger sensed instability, but not inevitability. Few imagined the complete transformation that lay ahead. Religion provided reassurance. Clergy framed events as trials rather than turning points. Sermons emphasized endurance, faith, and obedience. Conflict was interpreted within moral frameworks that assumed continuity rather than rupture. Families planned cautiously. Some delayed westward movement. Others pressed forward despite risk. Life decisions adjusted slightly, but not dramatically. The future still appeared navigable. George Washington's experience reflected broader uncertainty. His early military failure did not yet define his reputation. It was viewed as part of learning, not as the beginning of legend. Careers continued, ambitions adapted. No one foresaw the role he would later play. This perspective mattered. History often appears inevitable in retrospect. In 1754, nothing felt inevitable. The empire still seemed capable of resolving disputes. Authority still commanded respect. Loyalty still anchored identity. Yet cracks had formed. They were not visible to everyone. They did not provoke immediate reaction. But they altered assumptions subtly and unevenly. Colonists began to notice that expectations were diverging. They believed contribution should bring recognition. British officials increasingly believed control should follow cost. Both views emerged from the same events. This divergence did not yet produce resistance. It produced confusion. Confusion delayed confrontation. It allowed hope to persist longer than logic might suggest. It kept the relationship intact, even as its foundation weakened. By the end of 1754, the conflict had not yet been named. It existed as tension rather than war, as uncertainty rather than crisis, as pressure rather than rupture. People believed the empire would endure. They believed the system would adapt. They believed the future, though difficult, remained familiar. What they did not yet understand was that the war unfolding around them would teach Britain and its colonies different lessons, and those lessons, once learned, would not be reconciled easily. The year ended not with resolution, but with expectation. Expectation that the empire would correct itself. Expectation that loyalty would be rewarded. Expectation that violence would remain contained. Those expectations would soon be tested. Part 7. When the War Became Real, 1755. In 1755, the conflict that had simmered along the frontier became impossible to ignore. What had begun as scattered violence and contested claims in 1754 now demanded attention from imperial authorities. The illusion that tension could be contained locally began to fade. Decisions made this year would transform a colonial dispute into a formal war, even if many people did not yet understand the scale of what was unfolding. For colonists, the year began with expectation rather than fear. They believed Britain would now intervene decisively. The frontier clashes of the previous year were interpreted as a signal that stronger leadership was required, not as evidence that the system itself was failing. Confidence in imperial power remained strong. Britain appeared ready to respond. Imperial planners recognized that control of North America was critical. French influence in the interior threatened trade, security, and prestige. The conflict could no longer be treated as a peripheral matter. In 1755, Britain committed more directly to the struggle. This commitment took visible form. British regular troops were dispatched to North America in significant numbers. Professional soldiers, trained and disciplined, arrived to supplement colonial militias. Their presence reassured many colonists. It signaled that the empire was taking responsibility. Yet it also introduced tension. British officers brought with them assumptions shaped by European warfare. They expected hierarchy, discipline, and obedience. Colonial militias operated differently. They were locally organized, socially embedded, and accustomed to negotiation rather than command. These differences were not yet political. They were cultural. Colonists respected British military expertise, but they did not see themselves as inferior. They believed local knowledge mattered. Frontier warfare, they argued, required flexibility rather than rigid formation. British officers often disagreed. They viewed colonial forces as undisciplined and unreliable. European military tradition emphasized order and uniformity. Deviations appeared as weakness rather than adaptation. These disagreements surfaced quickly. Joint operations exposed friction. Commands were misunderstood. Expectations clashed. Cooperation existed, but it was uneasy. Still, optimism persisted. Many colonists believed these issues would resolve with experience. The arrival of British troops was seen as temporary reinforcement, not permanent oversight. Once the French threat was neutralized, normal patterns would resume. This belief shaped participation. Colonial assemblies raised funds and supplied troops, though often reluctantly. They debated costs, but not purpose. Defense of the empire remained a shared goal. One campaign in particular symbolized imperial intent. A major British expedition was organized to challenge French control in the Ohio River Valley. Its objective was clear: assert dominance and remove French presence. The scale of the effort suggested confidence. The campaign ended in disaster. British forces, advancing through difficult terrain, encountered French and indigenous forces who understood the landscape far better. The resulting defeat shocked colonial observers. Losses were heavy. Leadership was questioned. Confidence shaken. The implications were profound. For the first time, colonists saw British military power fail decisively in North America. The empire no longer appeared invincible. Victory was no longer assumed. Yet this did not produce rebellion. Instead, it produced confusion. Colonists struggled to reconcile belief in imperial strength with evidence of vulnerability. They did not question loyalty, but they began to question competence. British authorities drew different conclusions. They viewed the defeat as evidence that colonial cooperation was insufficient. Militias were blamed for lack of discipline. Assemblies were criticized for delayed funding. The problem, from London's perspective, was colonial inadequacy. This divergence mattered. Both sides interpreted the same events differently. Colonists saw sacrifice and effort. British officials saw inefficiency and resistance. Each interpretation felt justified. By the end of 1755, the war was real, but the empire still felt intact. That belief would carry the colonies forward, for now. As 1755 progressed, the war ceased to be an abstraction for many colonists. Even for those far from the frontier, its presence became increasingly difficult to ignore. The conflict moved beyond reports and rumor and began to shape daily life in tangible ways. War was no longer something happening somewhere else. It entered towns, households, and local decision-making. The most immediate change was movement. Troops traveled through colonial roads and ports in numbers previously unseen. British regulars marched inland, supplies followed, wagons crowded streets, inns filled, farms were asked to provide food and lodging. What had once been quiet places became temporary centers of military activity. This visibility altered perception. The empire no longer felt distant. Authority now appeared in uniform, issuing orders, requesting resources, and enforcing priorities. For many colonists, this was their first sustained interaction with British regular forces. Reactions were mixed. Some welcomed the presence of professional soldiers. They represented protection and commitment. Others viewed them with unease. Soldiers disrupted routine. Their needs strained local resources. Their behavior was scrutinized closely. Colonial assemblies faced mounting pressure. They were asked to raise funds, provide supplies, and coordinate support for imperial forces. These requests were framed as necessities of war, but they collided with colonial traditions of local control and negotiation. Assemblies debated extensively. They did not refuse outright. Most complied, though often slowly and conditionally. Funding defense had always been contentious. War magnified the stakes. Decisions affected taxes, debt, and political authority. These debates were not ideological. They were practical. Colonies wanted assurance that sacrifices would be temporary and proportionate. They wanted recognition for their contribution. They expected cooperation, not command. British officers often misunderstood this process. They interpreted debate as reluctance, delay as resistance. From their perspective, war demanded efficiency and obedience. Colonial negotiation appeared unnecessary and obstructive. This difference in expectation deepened frustration. Colonists believed they were fulfilling obligations responsibly. British authorities believed colonists were falling short. Each side judged the other through incompatible standards. The frontier bore the heaviest burden. Settlements near contested regions faced renewed danger. Raids increased. Farms were abandoned. Families fled eastward. Militias were mobilized repeatedly, pulling men away from fields and livelihoods. For those communities, war was immediate and personal. Fear shaped decisions. Survival outweighed loyalty. Requests for protection intensified. Confidence in distant authority weakened as response lagged behind need. Yet even here, rebellion was not the response. Frontier settlers wanted more empire, not less. They wanted stronger protection, faster response, clearer commitment. Their frustration was directed at effectiveness, not legitimacy. Economic life adapted unevenly. Some benefited from war. Merchants secured military contracts. Shipbuilders and suppliers prospered. Ports handling military traffic saw increased activity. War created opportunity alongside disruption. Others suffered. Trade routes shifted. Insurance costs rose. Labor shortages appeared as men joined militias. Prices fluctuated. Stability eroded gradually rather than catastrophically. These uneven effects shaped perception. Those who benefited viewed the war as manageable. Those who suffered viewed it as destabilizing. Geography and occupation influenced outlook as much as ideology. Religion provided interpretation. Clergy framed the war in moral terms. Sermons emphasized duty, endurance, and divine testing. The conflict was presented as part of a larger providential order rather than as a sign of systemic failure. This framing reinforced patience. War was difficult but meaningful. Suffering was explained rather than questioned. Loyalty remained morally grounded. Indigenous nations experienced the war differently. They faced increasing pressure to choose sides. Neutrality became harder to sustain. Military movements disrupted trade and territory. Alliances carried greater risk. Some indigenous communities aligned more closely with French forces, believing British settlement posed a greater long-term threat. Others attempted to balance relationships, seeking advantage without commitment. European officials often failed to grasp this strategy. They interpreted shifting alliances as betrayal rather than adaptation. Misunderstanding intensified mistrust and retaliation. The war reshaped authority subtly. British officers asserted greater control over military operations. Colonial autonomy narrowed incrementally. Decisions previously handled locally were now influenced or overridden by imperial command. These changes were justified as temporary. Once the war ended, everyone assumed authority would return to normal. Colonial assemblies would resume control. Militias would disband. The system would reset. This assumption mattered. It allowed colonists to tolerate increased oversight without resistance. They viewed compliance as a short-term necessity rather than a permanent shift. British officials made a different assumption. They began to see centralized control as essential. War revealed weaknesses in colonial governance, they believed. Efficiency required authority. Autonomy appeared incompatible with imperial security. This difference in lesson learned remained unspoken. Neither side articulated it fully in 1755, but it shaped behavior. British officers acted with greater confidence. Colonial leaders grew more cautious. Daily life continued under strain. Families adjusted. Communities adapted. Sacrifice became normalized. War entered conversation, planning, and expectation. Yet identity remained stable. Colonists still called themselves British. They still believed victory would restore order. They still trusted the empire, even as they noticed its flaws more clearly. By the end of 1755, war had altered the colonies, not through ideology, but through experience. It had introduced authority into daily life. It had tested cooperation. It had revealed difference in expectation. But it had not yet broken the relationship. That would take time. By the middle of 1755, optimism had been replaced by shock. The defeat of British forces earlier in the year did more than alter military plans. It disrupted assumptions that had governed colonial life for generations. The war was no longer something Britain would manage efficiently while the colonies supported from the margins. It was now a shared struggle marked by failure, confusion, and loss. The meaning of that failure mattered more than the failure itself. For colonists, the defeat raised questions about leadership and preparation. British regulars had been expected to bring professionalism, discipline, and strategic clarity. Instead, they had suffered a decisive setback in unfamiliar terrain against an enemy who understood the land far better. This contradiction unsettled confidence. Colonists did not interpret the defeat as proof that Britain was weak. They still believed in imperial power. But they began to recognize that European military assumptions did not always translate to North American conditions. Frontier warfare followed different rules. This realization reinforced an existing belief. Colonists had long argued that local knowledge mattered. Terrain, weather, supply lines, and indigenous alliances shaped outcomes more than rigid formation and hierarchy. The defeat appeared to confirm this view. British officers drew a different conclusion. From their perspective, the loss exposed flaws in colonial cooperation. Militia forces were blamed for poor discipline. Colonial assemblies were criticized for inadequate preparation and delayed funding. The defeat became evidence that colonial systems were unreliable under pressure. This difference in interpretation widened an invisible gap. Colonists believed they had contributed in good faith. British officials believed colonial effort had fallen short. Each side viewed the other as partially responsible for failure. Blame circulated unevenly. In the colonies, criticism focused on command decisions and unfamiliar tactics. British officers were seen as brave but inflexible. Their confidence in European methods appeared misplaced. In Britain, attention turned toward colonial governance. Reports emphasized delays, debate, and lack of centralized authority. Colonial assemblies were portrayed as obstructionist. Autonomy was reframed as inefficiency. Neither side saw itself as unreasonable. Colonists believed debate ensured fairness and accountability. British officials believed debate endangered security. Both positions felt justified within their own frameworks. This divergence did not yet provoke open conflict. It produced resentment without articulation. The war intensified pressure on colonial resources. Militia enlistments increased. Supplies were requisitioned. Transport networks strained. Local economies adapted unevenly. The burden of war was felt more sharply in some regions than others. Communities near the frontier continued to suffer disproportionately. Raids, displacement, and fear persisted. Requests for protection grew louder. Response remained inconsistent. Confidence in rapid imperial support weakened further. Yet, even among those most affected, loyalty endured. They did not question Britain's right to command. They questioned Britain's ability to protect effectively. The distinction mattered. In political discourse, language remained restrained. Colonial leaders criticized policies and decisions, not legitimacy. Petitions sought improvement, not separation. The assumption that grievances would be addressed remained intact. British officials interpreted criticism differently. They saw dissatisfaction as resistance to authority rather than as concern for effectiveness. This perception influenced subsequent decisions about oversight and control. Indigenous nations reassessed strategy once again. The defeat demonstrated that British forces were not invincible. French alliances appeared more credible. Indigenous leaders recalculated risk and opportunity, seeking advantage amid uncertainty. European commanders often misunderstood these shifts. They interpreted changing alliances as disloyalty rather than adaptation. Retaliation followed. Violence escalated. Cycles of reprisal deepened mistrust. The war's complexity increased. No single authority controlled events. Local decisions carried disproportionate consequence. Communication failures multiplied. Each setback magnified tension. Colonial identity began to stretch under pressure. Colonists were asked to sacrifice more time, labor, and resources. They complied, but expectations of recognition and respect grew alongside contribution. Partnership, not subordination, remained the assumed relationship. British leadership increasingly viewed control as necessary. War demanded efficiency. Efficiency required authority. Authority required obedience. This logic gained traction within imperial planning. Colonists did not yet perceive this shift fully. They experienced increased direction but attributed it to wartime necessity. Few believed these changes would persist after peace was restored. This belief delayed confrontation. It allowed cooperation to continue despite accumulating friction. It preserved loyalty even as misunderstanding deepened. By late 1755, the war had reshaped perception, not because it had lasted long, but because it had failed early. Failure exposed difference in expectation. Colonists learned that British power was not absolute. British officials learned that colonial autonomy complicated command. Each lesson pointed in a different direction. Neither side recognized the long-term implication yet. The relationship remained intact, but the space for assumption narrowed. War had begun to teach Britain and its colonies different lessons. Those lessons would continue to accumulate, and they would not resolve easily. As 1755 drew to a close, the war had altered daily life, but it had not yet altered belief. Across the British-American colonies, people attempted to make sense of a year marked by defeat, sacrifice, and uncertainty. They did so using assumptions formed long before the conflict began. Those assumptions softened the meaning of events and delayed deeper questioning. Most colonists still believed the empire would correct itself. This belief was grounded in history. Britain had faced difficulty before and emerged stronger. Wars had brought disruption, but they had also brought opportunity and order afterward. Peace, when it came, was expected to restore familiar arrangements. The failures of 1755 were therefore interpreted as temporary. Defeat was blamed on circumstance rather than structure. Terrain, weather, and unfamiliar conditions explained military setbacks. Leadership errors were acknowledged, but they were not seen as systemic. The empire, in this view, had stumbled, not faltered. Loyalty remained the default position. Colonists continued to identify as British subjects. They spoke the language, followed the law, and participated in imperial trade. British culture remained aspirational. Few imagined a future outside this framework. Criticism did not equal rejection. Colonial leaders criticized tactics, coordination, and responsiveness, but they did so within accepted boundaries. Petitions and debates focused on improvement rather than opposition. The expectation was reform, not rupture. Even frustration was tempered by patience. Distance explained delay. Complexity justified inefficiency. War excused hardship. These explanations preserved faith in the system, even as strain increased. Frontier communities held more complicated views. Those who lived closest to violence experienced the war most directly. Loss of property, displacement, and fear shaped perception. Confidence in protection weakened, but allegiance did not dissolve. They wanted more empire involvement, not less. Their demands centered on defense, reinforcement, and clarity. They did not seek autonomy. They sought security. Urban centers remained more insulated. Ports continued to trade. Merchants adjusted to wartime conditions. Some benefited economically. For them, war was disruptive but manageable. Stability appeared within reach. These differing experiences mattered. They created uneven urgency. What felt existential to frontier settlers felt distant to coastal elites. Shared identity persisted, but shared experience did not. Colonial assemblies reflected this divide. Debates intensified over funding and authority. Assemblies balanced local interests against imperial demands. Compromise remained possible, but friction increased. Still, these debates stayed within established norms. No one spoke openly of independence. No one questioned the legitimacy of Parliament or the Crown. The political imagination had not yet expanded that far. British officials evaluated the year differently. From London, the colonies appeared increasingly complex to manage. Coordination failures, delayed funding, and decentralized authority were seen as liabilities. War exposed inefficiencies that peace had concealed. British planners began to reconsider assumptions. They questioned whether colonial autonomy was compatible with imperial security. Centralization appeared attractive. Control promised efficiency. This shift was subtle but important. It did not yet manifest as policy. It existed as attitude. Perception changed before action followed. Colonists did not yet sense this change fully. They experienced increased military presence and oversight, but they attributed it to wartime necessity. They assumed authority would recede after victory. This assumption was critical. It allowed cooperation to continue. It prevented resistance. It preserved trust even as misunderstanding deepened. Indigenous nations reached different conclusions. They recognized that the war was unlikely to end quickly. European competition threatened to engulf the interior permanently. Neutrality became increasingly difficult to maintain. Some indigenous leaders concluded that British settlement posed the greater long-term threat. Others sought to leverage the conflict to preserve autonomy. Choices were pragmatic and constrained. European officials rarely understood this calculus. They interpreted shifting alliances as unreliability. Retaliation followed. Violence escalated. Trust eroded further. Religious interpretation reinforced patience. Clergy framed the war as a test rather than a turning point. Sermons emphasized obedience, endurance, and faith. Conflict was placed within a moral framework that assumed continuity. This narrative comforted many. It suggested suffering had meaning. It reassured communities that hardship served a larger purpose. Families adjusted cautiously. Some delayed westward movement. Others continued despite risk. Planning became more conservative, but not radically different. The future still appeared navigable. The idea of permanent change had not yet taken hold. This was perhaps the most important belief of all. People believed the war would end. They believed order would return. They believed authority would stabilize. They believed loyalty would be rewarded. These beliefs shaped behavior. They encouraged compliance. They discouraged confrontation. They preserved the relationship even as pressure increased. By the end of 1755, the colonies stood in a state of suspended expectation. War was real. Sacrifice was growing, but the meaning of those sacrifices had not yet shifted. The empire still felt legitimate. The relationship still felt repairable. What had changed was not belief, but experience. Colonists had learned that war was harder than expected. British officials had learned that colonial governance was less efficient than assumed. Each side believed the lesson pointed toward improvement. Neither yet understood that those lessons were incompatible. The year ended without resolution, not because nothing had happened, but because no one yet believed the foundation had moved. That realization would come later. For now, hope endured. Part 8. Escalation and Expansion. 1756. A local war becomes a global conflict. In 1756, the conflict in North America crossed a threshold. What had begun as a contested struggle over territory and influence was no longer confined to forests, rivers, and frontier forts. Decisions made this year transformed the war into a global confrontation, reshaping how Britain, its colonies, and their rivals understood the stakes. For colonists, this change was not immediately obvious. Daily life already bore the marks of war. Troops moved through towns. Supplies were requisitioned. Militias were called up repeatedly. Loss and uncertainty had become familiar. Yet many still believed the conflict remained fundamentally colonial in nature, difficult but limited. That belief did not survive 1756. In Europe, Britain and France formally declared war. What had simmered as rivalry now became open conflict between empires. Alliances shifted. Other European powers were drawn in. The struggle for North America became inseparable from battles fought across oceans and continents. This declaration changed everything. For Britain, North America was no longer one theater among many. It became central to imperial strategy. Control of territory, trade routes, and influence in the New World would determine global power for generations. The war now demanded scale. British leadership expanded military commitment dramatically. More troops were raised, naval resources were redirected, command structures tightened. The empire prepared not for containment, but for dominance. Colonists felt this shift quickly. Requests from imperial authorities increased in frequency and urgency. Colonies were asked to provide more men, more money, more supplies. Expectations rose faster than capacity. Colonial assemblies responded unevenly. Some complied readily, fearing French victory and indigenous alliance against them. Others hesitated, constrained by finances, political division, or skepticism about imperial priorities. Debate intensified, but refusal remained rare. Still, tension grew. Colonists were being asked to sacrifice at a level they had not anticipated. The war no longer looked temporary. It appeared open-ended, demanding sustained commitment. British officials interpreted colonial hesitation harshly. From London's perspective, war required obedience and efficiency. Deliberation appeared dangerous. Colonial negotiation, once tolerated, now seemed obstructive. This shift in attitude mattered. Imperial authority began to assert itself more forcefully. Orders replaced requests. Expectations hardened into demands. The tone of communication changed before policy did. Military command reflected this transformation. British officers were given broader authority over colonial forces. Coordination improved in some areas, but resentment grew. Colonial leaders felt sidelined. Local knowledge was undervalued. Decision-making centralized. These changes were justified as necessary. Global war, British officials argued, could not be fought piecemeal. Efficiency required hierarchy. Victory required discipline. Colonists did not yet challenge this logic directly. They still believed sacrifice would bring reward. Victory would restore balance. Authority would relax after peace. This assumption preserved cooperation. On the frontier, escalation intensified danger. French and indigenous forces coordinated more effectively. Raids increased. Fortifications multiplied. Territory changed hands. Civilians were caught between competing claims. Indigenous nations reassessed alliances yet again. Global war altered calculations. French success or failure now depended on European outcomes as much as North American ones. Indigenous leaders weighed immediate survival against long-term consequence. Some doubled down on French alliances, seeing British expansion as a greater threat. Others attempted neutrality, though space for neutrality shrank rapidly. European commanders often misunderstood these decisions. They interpreted alliance shifts as loyalty or betrayal rather than strategy. Misinterpretation fueled retaliation. Violence escalated further. Economic life adjusted under pressure. Ports became centers of military logistics. Shipbuilding increased. Trade routes shifted to accommodate war needs. Some merchants prospered. Others struggled as insurance costs rose and uncertainty spread. Inflation and scarcity appeared in some regions. War disrupted supply chains. Prices fluctuated. Labor shortages emerged as men joined military service. Daily planning became more complex. Religious leaders framed the escalation as providential. Sermons emphasized endurance, duty, and obedience. War was presented as a trial that demanded unity rather than dissent. This narrative reinforced patience and discouraged questioning. Families adapted cautiously. They delayed plans, conserved resources, and accepted disruption as necessary. The future still felt uncertain, but manageable. Yet beneath this adjustment, perception shifted. Colonists began to notice that imperial expectations were changing. Authority felt heavier. Sacrifice felt less negotiable. Contribution felt assumed rather than requested. British officials noticed something else. They saw colonial compliance as insufficient. Debate and delay frustrated planning. Autonomy appeared increasingly incompatible with global war. Both sides believed they were responding responsibly to crisis. Neither believed the relationship itself was under threat. Yet the escalation of 1756 altered the foundation quietly. The war was no longer a colonial problem with imperial assistance. It was an imperial war with colonial involvement. That distinction mattered. It reshaped authority. It reshaped expectation. It reshaped how Britain viewed its colonies, and how the colonies experienced Britain. By the end of 1756, the conflict had expanded beyond its origins. The world was at war, and the colonies were no longer fighting at the margins of empire. They were inside its machinery. As 1756 unfolded, the war reshaped not only battlefields, but the structure of authority itself. What had once been a loose partnership between Britain and its colonies began to harden into a more defined hierarchy. This shift did not arrive through a single decree or dramatic confrontation. It emerged gradually, through changes in command, expectation, and control that accumulated over time. For British leadership, the logic felt unavoidable. A global war demanded coordination. Coordination required authority. Authority required compliance. The decentralized nature of colonial governance, once tolerated, now appeared inefficient and risky. Imperial planners sought consistency. They wanted predictable funding, reliable troop numbers, and unified command. Colonial variation complicated strategy. Local debate delayed action. Negotiation interfered with urgency. From London's perspective, the solution was clear. Command needed to be centralized. British officers were granted broader powers over colonial forces. Military decisions increasingly bypassed colonial assemblies. Orders flowed downward rather than outward. Requests became directives. This transformation was framed as necessity. War, British officials argued, could not be fought through compromise. The stakes were too high. Efficiency demanded structure. Structure demanded obedience. Colonists experienced this shift differently. They were accustomed to local authority and negotiation. Colonial assemblies had long controlled taxation, militia organization, and resource allocation. These practices were not signs of disloyalty, but expressions of political tradition. The new tone felt unfamiliar. British officers expected compliance without debate. Colonial leaders expected consultation. When consultation disappeared, resentment grew quietly. This resentment was not ideological. Colonists did not yet challenge imperial legitimacy. They did not argue for independence. Their concerns centered on process and respect. They believed contribution deserved recognition. Colonial forces supplied manpower, supplies, and local expertise. They endured disruption and danger. They expected partnership rather than subordination. British officials viewed these expectations skeptically. From their vantage point, colonies were beneficiaries of imperial protection. Contribution was obligation, not leverage. Debate was inconvenience, not right. This difference in assumption widened the gap. Military operations exposed these tensions repeatedly. British commanders favored European tactics and formations. Colonial militias favored flexibility and adaptation. Disagreements over strategy became routine. When operations failed, blame followed. British officers cited militia indiscipline and colonial inefficiency. Colonists cited rigid tactics and disregard for local conditions. Each interpretation reinforced existing belief. Authority increasingly resolved disputes. British command structures overruled colonial input more often. Decisions were made centrally. Autonomy narrowed incrementally. These changes affected daily life. Colonial governments found themselves implementing policies they had not shaped. Resources were requisitioned more directly. Local priorities were subordinated to imperial needs. Assemblies complied, but reluctantly. Funding debates intensified. Tax burdens increased. Debt accumulated. Political friction grew, yet resistance remained limited. Colonists still believed these impositions were temporary. War justified sacrifice. Peace would restore balance. This belief preserved cooperation. British officials began to doubt it. They observed ongoing negotiation and delay. They interpreted it as resistance rather than tradition. Confidence in colonial governance declined further. As authority tightened, trust eroded. Not through confrontation, but through accumulation. Frontier conditions worsened. Raids continued. Settlements suffered. Requests for protection multiplied. Response remained uneven. Centralized command improved coordination in some areas, but not all. Colonists questioned effectiveness. If authority was increasing, why did security remain uncertain? If sacrifice was required, why did protection lag? These questions circulated quietly. Indigenous nations experienced intensified pressure. Centralized command reduced flexibility. Alliances were treated as tools rather than relationships. Misunderstanding deepened. Violence escalated. Indigenous leaders recognized that global war reduced their leverage. European powers prioritized victory over accommodation. Autonomy narrowed further. Economic strain spread. War expenditures increased taxes and debt. Trade patterns shifted. Inflation affected daily life. Burdens were felt unevenly across regions and classes. Some prospered, others struggled. This uneven impact shaped perception. Those benefiting from war viewed authority as necessary. Those suffering questioned its fairness. Geography and occupation mattered more than ideology. Religion continued to frame response. Clergy urged unity and obedience. Authority was portrayed as divinely sanctioned during crisis. Questioning was discouraged. Endurance was praised. This moral framing reinforced patience. Families adapted cautiously. They delayed plans, conserved resources, and accepted disruption as normal. The future still appeared uncertain but not hopeless. Yet something subtle changed. Colonists began to experience authority differently. It felt heavier, less negotiable, less familiar. British officials experienced colonies differently as well. They saw complexity rather than cooperation, delay rather than commitment, autonomy rather than efficiency. These perceptions hardened. Neither side articulated the full implication yet, but the relationship shifted from partnership toward management. By the end of 1756, escalation had transformed governance, not through rebellion, not through ideology, but through war-driven necessity. Authority had changed shape. Control had increased. Limits had been revealed. The empire still held together, but the terms of belonging had begun to change. As the war deepened in 1756, its demands spread unevenly across the colonies. Escalation did not produce a uniform experience. Instead, it revealed differences in geography, economy, and social structure that shaped how sacrifice was felt and understood. Some communities absorbed the pressure with relative ease. Others bore costs that altered daily life in lasting ways. This uneven burden mattered. It shaped perception long before it shaped ideology. The most immediate strain fell on manpower. Militia service expanded as the war required sustained presence rather than short-term mobilization. Men were called up repeatedly, sometimes for extended periods. Farms lost labor during critical seasons. Trades suffered interruption. Households adjusted to absence and uncertainty. For frontier communities, this strain was constant. Militia service was not optional. Protection depended on participation. Men rotated between defense and survival, leaving families vulnerable both at home and in the field. Exhaustion accumulated. In coastal and urban centers, the experience differed. While some men enlisted, others remained insulated by occupation or wealth. Merchants, artisans, and officials were less likely to face prolonged service. Distance from the frontier reduced urgency. This contrast fostered resentment. Frontier settlers questioned whether sacrifice was shared fairly. Coastal elites questioned whether frontier demands were sustainable. Each believed the other misunderstood reality. Economic strain followed manpower demands. War disrupted labor markets. Shortages drove wages up in some areas while depressing productivity in others. Prices fluctuated. Credit tightened. Debt increased. Colonial governments borrowed heavily. Funding the war required taxes, loans, and requisitions. Assemblies debated methods, but options were limited. The financial burden fell unevenly, often hitting small farmers and laborers hardest. Some sectors prospered. Merchants securing military contracts benefited from steady demand. Shipbuilders, suppliers, and transport operators found opportunity in wartime logistics. War redistributed wealth as much as it consumed it. This redistribution sharpened division. Those benefiting from war viewed it as manageable and necessary. Those losing income or stability viewed it as disruptive and unjust. Experience shaped belief more than rhetoric. Communities adapted in different ways. Some pooled resources. Others relied on informal networks of support. Churches and local organizations filled gaps where government response lagged. Religion continued to provide meaning. Clergy framed sacrifice as virtuous and necessary. Suffering was portrayed as service to both God and crown. This framing encouraged endurance and discouraged protest. Yet even moral reassurance had limits. As strain persisted, patience thinned. Complaints increased. Petitions multiplied. Assemblies faced mounting pressure from constituents struggling to cope. Frontier violence intensified the burden. Raids destroyed property. Displacement increased. Families fled. Recovery was slow and uncertain. Protection remained inconsistent despite increased authority. Those experiencing violence questioned effectiveness. If sacrifice was required, why did security remain fragile? If authority had increased, why did response lag? These questions circulated quietly, shaping attitude without provoking open resistance. Indigenous communities faced disproportionate cost. War disrupted trade, territory, and autonomy. European escalation reduced space for negotiation. Violence spread into regions previously stable. Choices narrowed. Indigenous leaders adapted under pressure. Some aligned firmly with one side, hoping to secure protection. Others attempted to preserve autonomy through limited engagement. Each choice carried risk. European commanders often misunderstood these decisions. They interpreted adaptation as unreliability. Retaliation followed. Cycles of violence deepened. Colonial unity weakened subtly. Shared identity remained, but shared experience did not. Geography, class, and occupation divided perception. What felt necessary to one community felt excessive to another. These divisions complicated governance. Assemblies struggled to balance competing demands. Policy satisfied some while alienating others. Authority was exercised unevenly, reinforcing disparity. British officials viewed these divisions with concern. They interpreted uneven compliance as evidence of weak governance. Centralization appeared increasingly justified. Local variation was seen as obstacle rather than reality. Colonists experienced centralization as pressure. Decisions arrived from above, flexibility narrowed, local priorities were overridden, frustration grew quietly. Still, resistance did not emerge. The war remained the dominant explanation. Sacrifice was temporary. Inequity was unfortunate, but necessary. Peace would restore balance. This belief persisted. It allowed the system to continue functioning despite strain. It delayed confrontation by preserving hope. By late 1756, the war's burden was undeniable. Lives were disrupted, resources depleted, expectations stretched. Yet belief remained largely intact. Colonists still believed the empire would reward sacrifice. British officials still believed authority would ensure success. Both assumptions rested on incomplete understanding. The uneven burden of war did not yet produce rebellion. It produced awareness. Awareness of difference. Awareness of strain. Awareness that sacrifice was not shared equally. These realizations accumulated quietly. They did not yet challenge loyalty, but they reshaped how loyalty was felt. And they would matter long after the war itself moved on. By the end of 1756, the war had become a constant presence in colonial life, but belief had not yet shifted as dramatically as experience. People had adapted to disruption. They had absorbed sacrifice into daily routine. What they had not yet done was reinterpret the meaning of that sacrifice. Most still believed the war fit within familiar patterns, even as those patterns strained. The dominant belief remained continuity. Colonists continued to assume the empire would endure and correct itself. War was understood as an extraordinary period that demanded extraordinary effort, not as a signal of permanent transformation. Authority had expanded, but it was still viewed as temporary. This belief shaped compliance. Colonial assemblies continued to fund military needs despite growing debt. Communities continued to supply men and resources despite fatigue. Individuals endured disruption because they expected resolution. The expectation of reward mattered deeply. Colonists believed contribution would be recognized. Loyalty, sacrifice, and cooperation were assumed to carry value within the imperial system. This assumption sustained participation, even as strain increased. Criticism remained contained. Debates focused on efficiency, fairness, and coordination rather than legitimacy. Complaints were framed as appeals for improvement, not challenges to authority. Petitions sought relief, not separation. Even frustration respected boundaries. The language of resistance had not yet emerged. the political imagination still operated within imperial limits. Britain was criticized as distant or inefficient, not unjust. Frontier communities held more fragile beliefs. Those exposed to violence questioned whether protection matched sacrifice. Confidence in response weakened. Yet even here, the solution imagined was more authority, not less. They wanted stronger commitment, more troops, faster response, clearer command. They did not seek autonomy. Urban and coastal populations felt war differently. Trade disruptions were real, but opportunity remained. Military contracts provided income. Ports adapted. Stability appeared achievable. This divergence in experience reinforced differing beliefs. Those insulated from violence viewed hardship as manageable. Those exposed to danger viewed it as exhausting but necessary. Shared identity persisted, but shared urgency did not. British officials interpreted the year with growing concern. They saw colonies under strain, but they also saw hesitation, debate, and uneven compliance. These patterns reinforced belief that colonial governance lacked efficiency. Centralization appeared increasingly justified. Authority in this view was not oppression but solution. War required discipline. Discipline required control. This logic hardened quietly. British leaders did not yet announce new policies. They did not articulate a new vision of empire. But their assumptions shifted. Colonists did not yet sense the depth of this change. They experienced heavier oversight, but they explained it as wartime necessity. They assumed autonomy would return after peace. This assumption preserved trust. Religion continued to stabilize belief. Clergy framed the war as purposeful suffering. Endurance was praised. Obedience was sanctified. Questioning authority during crisis was discouraged. This framing reinforced patience. Families adjusted expectations. They delayed plans, conserved resources, planned cautiously. Life continued under constraint, but not despair. The future still felt navigable. The idea of permanent change had not yet taken hold. This belief was powerful. It allowed people to endure circumstances that might otherwise have provoked resistance. It postponed ideological shift by maintaining hope in restoration. Indigenous communities reached different conclusions. They saw the war as transformative. European conflict increasingly constrained autonomy. Choices narrowed. Survival required constant recalculation. Their experience highlighted a contrast. Where colonists saw temporary disruption, indigenous nations saw permanent threat. This difference in perspective would shape future conflict. By the close of 1756, escalation had reshaped the empire's internal dynamics. Authority had grown heavier, sacrifice had increased, strain had spread unevenly, yet belief remained largely intact. The empire still felt legitimate. The relationship still felt repairable. Most people believed the war would end and normal arrangements would resume. That belief delayed confrontation. It allowed cooperation to continue despite pressure. It preserved loyalty even as experience challenged assumption. But beneath that belief, something had shifted. Expectations had stretched. Trust had thinned. Authority had changed shape. These changes were not yet named. They were not yet resisted. But they had become part of lived experience. And once experience changes, belief eventually follows. The year ended with endurance, not resolution, with hope, not certainty, with loyalty intact but tested. The war would continue. So would the strain. And the lessons learned in 1756 would not be forgotten. Part 9. Turning Points and Reassessment, 1757. By 1757, The war had lost its sense of direction. The confidence that had once driven imperial strategy gave way to frustration and uncertainty. After years of escalating commitment, neither Britain nor its colonies could point to decisive progress in North America. The conflict continued, but its purpose felt increasingly blurred. For colonists, this was unsettling. They had accepted sacrifice with the expectation of resolution. War, in their experience, was supposed to move toward victory or settlement. Instead, 1757 delivered delay, indecision, and repetition. The war seemed stuck, consuming resources without providing clarity. Military operations reflected this stagnation. Campaigns advanced cautiously, if at all. Fortifications were strengthened rather than expanded. Troop movements were limited. Commanders hesitated, wary of repeating costly mistakes. The war became defensive rather than assertive. This caution had consequences. It prolonged exposure to danger without reducing it. Frontier communities remained vulnerable. Raids continued. Settlements were abandoned or fortified. Protection was uneven and often reactive. Colonists closest to the conflict felt trapped in uncertainty. They could not retreat easily, yet they could not rely on decisive imperial protection. Requests for reinforcement multiplied, but responses lagged. Confidence in planning weakened. British leadership recognized the problem, but struggled to solve it. Strategic disagreements persisted. European priorities competed with colonial needs. Resources were finite. Decisions were delayed by debate and caution. From London's perspective, North America was only one theater of a global war. This reality shaped allocation of attention and resources. While colonies viewed the conflict as immediate and existential, imperial planners weighed it against events elsewhere. This mismatch deepened frustration. Colonists expected focus and urgency. British officials balanced competing demands. Each side believed the other misunderstood the stakes. Command structures reflected growing strain. Authority had increased, but effectiveness had not followed proportionally. Centralized control improved coordination in theory, but in practice it often slowed response. Orders traveled long distances. Conditions changed before instructions arrived. Local commanders faced difficult choices. They balanced obedience against adaptation. Deviating from orders risked discipline. Following them risked failure. This tension produced caution rather than initiative. Colonial militias felt the impact. Repeated mobilizations exhausted manpower. Enthusiasm waned. Service felt endless rather than purposeful. Communities struggled to sustain participation. Economic strain intensified. War expenditures continued to rise. Assemblies borrowed more. Debt accumulated. Tax burdens increased. The promise that sacrifice would be temporary grew harder to sustain. Some benefited despite stagnation. Military contracts persisted. Supply networks expanded. War remained profitable for certain sectors. This uneven benefit sharpened division. Those profiting from war viewed delay as manageable. Those suffering viewed it as intolerable. Public conversation reflected this divide. Complaints increased, but language remained restrained. Colonists criticized inefficiency rather than authority. The war was questioned, not the empire. Yet patience thinned. The absence of progress undermined confidence. Each additional year of war without resolution weakened belief that existing arrangements were sufficient. Indigenous nations adapted once more. Stalemate altered alliance calculations. No clear victor emerged. Indigenous leaders weighed continued engagement against preservation of autonomy. Choices remained constrained and risky. European commanders often failed to account for this fluidity. They treated alliances as fixed rather than conditional. Miscalculation followed. Violence escalated without strategic gain. Religious interpretation struggled to keep pace. Clergy continued to frame endurance as virtuous, but repetition eroded reassurance. Suffering without progress tested faith in providential purpose. Families felt the weight of uncertainty. Plans were delayed repeatedly, futures were postponed. Stability felt increasingly fragile. Yet, belief persisted. Colonists still assumed the war would end. They still expected order to return. They still trusted that loyalty would matter. What changed in 1757 was not belief itself, but confidence in timing. The war no longer felt temporary. It felt unresolved. This realization marked a subtle turning point, not toward rebellion, but toward reassessment. People began to ask quieter questions. How long could this continue? How much sacrifice was reasonable? What would victory actually restore? These questions did not yet challenge authority. They challenged expectation. And once expectation shifts, belief eventually follows. By the end of 1757, the war remained active but directionless. Momentum had stalled. Confidence had weakened. The empire still held, but certainty had begun to erode. As 1757 continued, frustration replaced urgency as the defining mood of the war. The lack of progress forced leaders on both sides of the Atlantic to confront an uncomfortable reality. Existing strategies were not producing results. Victory remained distant, yet retreat was unthinkable. The war demanded reassessment, even if no one could yet agree on what change should look like. British leadership began to question assumptions. Early confidence that professional troops and centralized command would quickly resolve the conflict had not been rewarded. Campaigns stalled. Forts changed hands slowly, if at all. Resources were consumed without decisive gain. From London's perspective, the problem appeared structural. North America was vast, difficult to navigate, and resistant to European military logic. Distance complicated communication. Weather disrupted planning. Indigenous alliances shifted unpredictably. The war defied clean solutions. Imperial planners debated alternatives. Some argued for greater concentration of force, believing overwhelming strength could break the stalemate. Others favored defensive consolidation, protecting key positions while waiting for opportunities elsewhere in the global conflict. These debates delayed action. While strategies were discussed, conditions on the ground remained unchanged. Frontier communities continued to face insecurity. Colonial forces remained stretched thin. Momentum did not return. Colonists felt the consequences of indecision. They had committed resources expecting direction and clarity. Instead, they received continued requests without visible improvement. Confidence in leadership weakened further. This did not yet translate into defiance. Colonial assemblies continued to comply with funding and supply demands. Militias continued to mobilize. Cooperation persisted, but enthusiasm diminished. The war increasingly felt mismanaged. Colonists began to distinguish between loyalty to Britain and confidence in British planning. They still supported the empire, but they questioned whether imperial leaders understood colonial realities. This distinction was subtle but important. It allowed criticism to grow without challenging legitimacy. Complaints focused on competence rather than authority. British officials interpreted criticism differently. They saw frustration as evidence of colonial impatience and unreliability. Debate was viewed as distraction. Questioning strategy was interpreted as resistance to discipline. This misinterpretation widened the gap. Each side believed it was responding reasonably to difficulty. Each believed the other misunderstood the problem. Military command reflected this tension. Officers faced pressure to deliver results, but lacked clear guidance. Risk-taking was discouraged. Failure carried blame. Caution became the default posture. Caution prolonged stalemate. Operations prioritized defense over initiative. Forts were held rather than expanded. Engagements were avoided unless advantage was clear. The war slowed further. Colonial militias responded unevenly. Repeated service without progress eroded morale. Participation declined in some areas. Enforcement increased, creating resentment. Service felt compulsory rather than purposeful. Economic frustration grew, war spending continued, debt deepened, taxes increased. The promise that war would stimulate prosperity faded as costs mounted. Merchants and contractors still benefited, but their gains highlighted inequality. Those profiting from war appeared insulated from its burdens. Those bearing the cost questioned fairness. Division sharpened along economic and geographic lines. Public discussion reflected reassessment. Colonists debated not whether to support the war, but how much sacrifice was justified. The question of limits entered conversation. How long could communities sustain this level of commitment? These discussions remained cautious. Language avoided confrontation. Appeals emphasized relief and reform rather than refusal. The expectation of eventual improvement persisted. Indigenous nations faced intensified calculation. Stalemate reduced incentives for commitment. Without clear advantage, alliance carried risk without reward. Some indigenous leaders sought to disengage where possible. Others leveraged uncertainty to negotiate terms. European commanders struggled to adapt. They continued to pursue alliances without fully understanding indigenous priorities. Miscommunication persisted. Violence escalated without strategic gain. Religion offered diminishing reassurance. Sermons continued to emphasize endurance, but repetition weakened their effect. Faith in providential resolution strained under prolonged uncertainty. Families experienced fatigue. Plans were delayed again and again. Stability remained elusive. The future felt postponed rather than shaped. Yet belief endured. Colonists still assumed the war would end. They still believed victory would restore balance. They still trusted the empire to correct course eventually. What changed in 1757 was patience. Reassessment did not yet produce opposition. It produced calculation. People began to measure cost more carefully. They weighed sacrifice against outcome. They considered limits that had not previously been imagined. British officials engaged in similar calculation. They questioned whether existing colonial arrangements could sustain global war. Centralization appeared increasingly necessary. Autonomy increasingly problematic. These conclusions remained internal. They had not yet become policy, but they shaped planning, they shaped attitude, they shaped future decisions. By late 1757, the war stood at a crossroads. Stalemate forced reassessment. Frustration demanded recalculation. Neither Britain nor its colonies had abandoned the relationship, but both were quietly rethinking its terms. The war had not yet broken loyalty, but it had begun to reshape expectation. And expectation, once altered, would not easily return. By 1757, uncertainty had become the defining condition of colonial life. The war no longer arrived in sharp bursts of mobilization, followed by return to normalcy. Instead, it lingered. Its demands were constant. its end undefined. Communities were forced to adapt not to crisis, but to continuation. This change altered how people experienced time. Plans were postponed rather than canceled. Futures were delayed rather than abandoned. Families learned to live without clear expectations of resolution. The war became part of daily calculation. Frontier communities bore the heaviest weight. Exposure to violence remained unpredictable. Raids occurred without warning. Defense required constant vigilance. Settlements existed in a state of readiness that never fully relaxed. For these communities, uncertainty was physical. Homes were fortified. Fields were worked cautiously. Travel was restricted. Life narrowed around survival. The line between civilian and military life blurred completely. Yet even here, endurance replaced panic. People adapted routines. Watch schedules were established. Mutual aid networks strengthened. Fear became familiar rather than paralyzing. In interior towns, uncertainty took a different form. These communities supplied men and resources but faced less direct violence. The war disrupted labor and commerce without immediate threat to life. Absence rather than danger shaped experience. Households adjusted to missing labor. Farms operated with fewer hands. Children assumed greater responsibility. Women managed finances and production more actively. These changes were practical responses, not ideological shifts. Still, the strain accumulated. Repeated absences weakened productivity. Debts increased. Recovery between mobilizations shortened. Stability eroded incrementally. Urban and port cities experienced uncertainty economically. Trade routes shifted unpredictably. Insurance costs rose. Markets fluctuated. Some merchants adapted quickly, others failed. War created opportunity and risk simultaneously. Those able to secure contracts or diversify trade benefited. Those tied to disrupted routes suffered. This uneven outcome reinforced awareness of inequality. Communities responded differently based on experience. Those insulated from violence often viewed endurance as reasonable. Those exposed to constant danger viewed uncertainty as exhausting. Geography shaped belief more than rhetoric. Public gatherings reflected these differences. Town meetings debated resource allocation. Churches provided reassurance. Markets became spaces of information exchange as much as commerce. Conversation shifted subtly. People spoke less about victory and more about duration. The question was no longer whether the war would end, but when and at what cost. This shift mattered. It reframed sacrifice as ongoing rather than temporary. Expectations adjusted accordingly. Colonial governments struggled to respond. Assemblies faced competing pressures. Frontier demands for protection conflicted with interior resistance to increased taxation. Urban interests sought stability. Rural communities sought relief. No solution satisfied all. Policy became reactive. Decisions addressed immediate need rather than long-term planning. This approach preserved functionality, but not confidence. British officials observed these dynamics imperfectly. Distance limited understanding. Reports emphasized numbers rather than experience. Colonial variation appeared as inconsistency rather than adaptation. This perception reinforced belief that stronger control was needed. Centralization promised clarity. Uniform policy promised efficiency. Local complexity was seen as obstacle. Colonists experienced this differently. They felt decisions arriving from afar, often without appreciation of local conditions. Flexibility narrowed. Frustration grew, yet resistance remained muted. Communities continued to comply with demands despite strain. Loyalty persisted because alternatives were unimaginable. The empire remained the framework within which life operated. Religion continued to shape endurance. Sermons emphasized patience and perseverance. Suffering was framed as collective responsibility. Questioning authority was discouraged during prolonged trial. This framing stabilized communities. It provided moral justification for uncertainty. It transformed endurance into virtue. But repetition dulled reassurance. Faith sustained behavior more than belief. People continued to endure even as confidence wavered. Indigenous communities experienced uncertainty more acutely. European stalemate prolonged disruption. Trade fluctuated. Alliances became riskier. Violence spread unpredictably. Indigenous leaders navigated uncertainty strategically. They sought to preserve autonomy amid shifting power. They avoided irreversible commitments when possible. They adapted continuously. European commanders often failed to recognize this adaptability. They misread caution as unreliability. Retaliation followed. Violence deepened without resolution. The war's prolonged nature reshaped identity subtly. Colonists began to see themselves as participants in an extended imperial struggle rather than temporary contributors. This shift altered how obligation was felt. Sacrifice became expected. Endurance became normal. Uncertainty became routine. This normalization mattered. It allowed the war to continue without immediate collapse of cooperation. It also eroded confidence gradually, without dramatic rupture. People learned to live with unresolved conditions. But living with uncertainty is not the same as accepting it. By late 1757, communities were still functioning, but they were changed. They were more cautious, more fatigued, more aware of limits. They had not rejected authority. They had not imagined separation. But they had begun to sense that existing arrangements might not restore stability quickly or easily. The war had not yet produced opposition. It had produced endurance under strain, and endurance, when prolonged, reshapes expectation. That quiet transformation continued, not loudly, not defiantly, but persistently. As 1757 drew to a close, uncertainty had become the shared condition across the colonies. Different communities experienced it differently, but none escaped it. The war continued, so did the waiting, and waiting without clarity would shape what came next. By the end of 1757, belief had not collapsed, but it had shifted. Colonists did not suddenly abandon loyalty to Britain. They did not imagine independence. They did not frame their experience in revolutionary terms. What changed instead was how they understood the relationship between sacrifice, authority, and outcome. The dominant belief became endurance without certainty. People still expected the war to end. They still assumed peace would restore order. But they no longer believed resolution was imminent. The war felt prolonged, complicated, and resistant to simple solutions. This altered how sacrifice was interpreted. Earlier sacrifices had been justified by progress or hope of resolution. By late 1757, sacrifice was justified by necessity alone. Participation continued, not because it promised reward, but because there was no alternative. This distinction mattered. It transformed obedience from optimism into obligation. Colonial assemblies reflected this shift. They continued to fund the war, but debates grew more contentious. Taxation was no longer framed as temporary inconvenience, but as an ongoing burden requiring justification. Still, the language of legitimacy held. Complaints targeted inefficiency rather than authority. Criticism remained internal to the imperial framework. Britain was not rejected, it was questioned. This questioning did not yet feel dangerous. Colonists believed debate was compatible with loyalty. They assumed critique would strengthen, not weaken, the relationship. This belief sustained engagement even as confidence eroded. British officials interpreted these debates differently. They saw discussion as delay, questioning as resistance, autonomy as liability. Their belief in the necessity of control hardened. This divergence in interpretation deepened quietly. Neither side fully recognized the other's assumptions. Misunderstanding accumulated without confrontation. Communities adjusted belief unevenly. Those insulated from violence maintained greater confidence in the imperial system. Those exposed to frontier danger were more skeptical. Experience shaped belief more than ideology. Religion continued to provide interpretive stability. Clergy emphasized patience and submission. War was framed as trial rather than failure. This framing preserved order, even as reassurance weakened. Faith shifted from explanation to endurance. People continued to behave loyally even when belief felt strained. Families adapted expectations. They planned cautiously. They conserved resources. They postponed long-term decisions. Life was lived provisionally rather than confidently. This provisional mindset spread. The future was no longer imagined clearly. It was managed cautiously. Indigenous nations drew different conclusions. They increasingly saw European conflict as destabilizing rather than negotiable. Autonomy felt threatened regardless of outcome. Belief shifted toward preservation rather than alliance. This contrast mattered. Where colonists still believed in restoration, indigenous communities often believed in survival under constraint. These differing beliefs would shape future conflict. By year's end, no single narrative dominated. Belief varied by location, experience, and burden. But a common thread emerged. Confidence had weakened, patience had shortened, expectation had narrowed, yet loyalty remained. The empire still felt legitimate. Authority still felt binding. Obedience still felt required. What had changed was the emotional foundation beneath those beliefs. People no longer trusted momentum. They trusted endurance. This shift delayed rupture. It allowed the system to continue functioning under strain, but it also ensured that when change came, it would feel overdue rather than sudden. By the close of 1757, the war remained unresolved. Belief had adjusted to that reality, not dramatically, not defiantly, but decisively. The colonies had not turned away from the empire, but they had begun to imagine limits, and imagining limits is the first step toward imagining alternatives. Those alternatives were not yet named, they were not yet desired, but the ground beneath belief had shifted, quietly, persistently, and it would not return to its earlier shape. Part 10. Restructure and Renewed Pressure, 1758. A change in direction. In 1758, the war changed course, not because it was ending, but because it could no longer continue as it had. Years of delay, miscalculation, and exhaustion forced British leadership to confront an uncomfortable truth. The existing approach in North America was failing. Authority had increased, resources had expanded, sacrifice had deepened, yet decisive results remained elusive. The solution was not retreat. It was restructuring. British leadership began the year with a renewed determination to impose coherence on a conflict that had resisted it. This determination was not ideological, it was practical. The war had reached a point where continuation without reform threatened credibility, cost, and control. A new strategy emerged. Britain committed to greater focus on North America as a central theater rather than a secondary concern. Resources were redirected. Leadership was reorganized. Planning emphasized coordination rather than caution. This shift mattered immediately. For the first time in years, colonial observers sensed momentum returning, not on the battlefield, but in decision-making. Orders were clearer. Objectives were more defined. Authority felt purposeful rather than reactive. The empire had decided to act decisively. This did not mean the war became easier. It meant it became more demanding. British expectations of colonial participation increased sharply. Troop quotas rose. Financial demands intensified. Supply requirements expanded. Sacrifice was no longer framed as temporary endurance, but as necessary investment in victory. Colonial assemblies responded with mixed resolve. They recognized the opportunity for progress. Many welcomed the possibility that renewed pressure might finally produce results. But the scale of demand tested their capacity. Debt deepened. Taxes rose. Debate sharpened. Still, compliance continued. The war had reached a point where withdrawal was unimaginable. Colonies were too invested, economically, socially, and emotionally, to disengage. Participation was no longer optional. Military command reflected renewed confidence. British officers received clearer directives and broader authority. Campaigns were planned with greater coordination between land and naval forces. Objectives were prioritized rather than scattered. This approach contrasted sharply with earlier years. Where previous strategy had been cautious and fragmented, 1758 emphasized concentration of effort. The goal was not merely containment, but advantage. Colonial forces were integrated more deliberately. Militias and provincial troops were assigned clearer roles. Coordination improved in some regions, though tension persisted. British officers still underestimated local knowledge. Colonial leaders still resented exclusion from decision-making, but efficiency improved. Not through harmony, but through pressure. This pressure was felt most intensely on the frontier. Renewed campaigns pushed into contested regions. Fortifications were targeted more aggressively. Movement increased. The war became more active. For frontier communities, this brought mixed emotion. Hope returned cautiously, so did fear. Activity meant opportunity for security, but also increased exposure to retaliation. The risk of violence intensified alongside the promise of progress. Indigenous nations faced renewed disruption. British restructuring reduced flexibility. Alliances were treated more instrumentally. Indigenous autonomy narrowed further as military objectives took precedence over negotiation. Some indigenous leaders sought to adapt to the new intensity. Others resisted. All faced shrinking space for neutrality. European commanders often failed to appreciate the long-term consequence of this approach. Short-term advantage came at the cost of trust. Misunderstanding deepened. Economic life adjusted once again. Military spending surged. Contracts multiplied. Labor demand increased. Some sectors benefited significantly. Others struggled under rising prices and taxation. The war reshaped opportunity unevenly. This unevenness sharpened awareness of disparity. Those benefiting from renewed momentum viewed pressure as justified. Those bearing increased cost questioned sustainability. Public conversation reflected guarded optimism. People spoke of progress cautiously. They hoped restructuring would bring resolution, but experience had tempered expectation. Confidence was conditional. Religion adapted its framing. Clergy emphasized perseverance with purpose. The war was portrayed as entering a decisive phase. Sacrifice was framed as meaningful rather than endless. This message restored some morale, but belief remained cautious. Families responded pragmatically. They prepared for continued disruption. They planned defensively. They adjusted expectations downward even as hope returned. Life continued under strain. What changed in 1758 was not belief in the empire, but belief in effectiveness. For the first time in years, the war appeared to have direction. This restored confidence in leadership, partially. Colonists still questioned authority. They still felt pressure. They still experienced uneven burden. But they could now imagine outcome. That imagination mattered. It allowed sacrifice to feel purposeful again. British officials interpreted renewed momentum as validation. They saw restructuring as proof that stronger control worked. Centralization appeared justified. Colonial autonomy appeared increasingly unnecessary. This conclusion would shape future policy. Colonists did not yet challenge it. They focused on the present, on progress, on survival. By the end of 1758's opening phase, the war had not been won, but it had been redefined. The years of drift had ended, the era of pressure had begun, and with it came consequences that would extend far beyond the battlefield. As Britain restructured its approach in 1758, the cost of renewed momentum became unmistakable. The war now demanded participation at a scale the colonies had not previously experienced. Earlier years had required endurance and adaptation. This phase required capacity. The difference mattered because capacity was finite. British leadership pressed harder. Troop quotas increased across multiple colonies. Financial contributions rose sharply. Supplies were no longer requested in anticipation of need, but demanded in preparation for action. The tone of communication reflected urgency rather than negotiation. Colonial assemblies responded with determination, tempered by concern. They recognized that restructuring offered the best chance for progress. Many leaders believed that intensified effort, though painful, could shorten the war and reduce long-term strain. Yet the magnitude of demand tested political, economic, and social limits. Funding became the central challenge. Colonial governments borrowed heavily to meet expectations. Debt accumulated rapidly. Taxation expanded to cover immediate costs, often without clear plans for repayment. These measures were accepted reluctantly, justified by necessity rather than confidence. Participation became unavoidable. Militia service expanded again, but this time with less flexibility. Men were called for longer terms. Substitutes were harder to secure. Enforcement increased as voluntary enlistment failed to meet demand. This shift altered how service was perceived. What had once been framed as civic duty now felt compulsory. Obligation replaced enthusiasm. Compliance continued, but resentment grew quietly. Communities adjusted under pressure. Households reorganized labor. Farms operated with fewer hands. Production slowed. Local economies adapted unevenly. Some areas absorbed strain through cooperation. Others struggled visibly. Frontier regions experienced intensified exposure. Renewed campaigns increased movement through contested territory. While this offered hope for security, it also heightened risk. Raids intensified as opposing forces responded to pressure. For those living closest to the conflict, participation felt immediate and personal. Losses were measured not in abstract numbers, but in disrupted lives and damaged property. confidence in renewed strategy remained cautious. Urban and coastal communities felt cost differently. They faced increased taxation, labor shortages, and inflation. At the same time, military contracts expanded opportunity for some. Shipbuilders, suppliers, and merchants benefited from sustained demand. This contrast sharpened awareness of inequality. Those profiting from war pressure viewed sacrifice as justified and manageable. Those bearing cost without benefit questioned fairness. These differing experiences shaped belief more than ideology. Colonial leaders struggled to balance these pressures. Assemblies debated allocation repeatedly. Decisions satisfied some constituents while alienating others. Political cohesion weakened under sustained demand. Still, refusal remained rare. Colonists continued to comply because alternatives felt impractical. The empire remained the framework within which solutions were imagined. Participation was still viewed as necessary, even if burdensome. British officials interpreted compliance as validation. They saw increased participation as evidence that pressure worked. Centralization appeared effective. Authority appeared justified by results. This interpretation mattered. It reinforced belief that colonial autonomy was a liability rather than an asset. Cooperation achieved through negotiation seemed unnecessary when compliance could be compelled. Colonists experienced the same events differently. They saw participation as sacrifice rather than proof of effectiveness. They measured success not by orders fulfilled, but by strain endured. This difference in interpretation widened the gap between expectation and experience. Military operations reflected renewed intensity. Campaigns moved forward more decisively. Coordination improved. Objectives became clearer. Progress, though costly, became visible. This progress restored cautious optimism. People began to believe the war might finally move toward resolution. Sacrifice felt purposeful again, if still heavy. Religion reinforced this interpretation. Clergy framed renewed pressure as meaningful trial. Suffering was presented as necessary investment rather than endless endurance. This framing restored some morale. Families adjusted once more. They planned around continued absence. They prepared for prolonged cost. They balanced hope against realism. Life remained constrained. What changed was perception of direction. The war no longer felt stalled. It felt demanding. That distinction mattered. By mid-1758, participation had deepened beyond earlier levels. So had cost. Colonists had not withdrawn. They had leaned in. But leaning in carried consequence. Debt increased, patience shortened, expectations sharpened. The war's renewed pressure did not yet provoke resistance, but it clarified limits. It revealed how much the colonies could give, and it raised an unspoken question that would linger beyond victory. What would be required once the war was won? That question remained unanswered. For now, participation continued. So did pressure, and the cost, once expanded, would not easily recede. As 1758 progressed, signs of movement began to appear, but progress carried consequences that reshaped how the war was understood. For the first time in years, campaigns produced visible results. Fortifications fell, territory shifted, military coordination improved. News of success traveled through the colonies, restoring a sense that sacrifice might finally lead somewhere. This change mattered deeply. Momentum altered perception more than outcome. Colonists did not measure success only by land gained or forts taken. They measured it by whether the war felt purposeful again. In that sense, 1758 delivered something new. Progress restored belief. cautiously. Communities that had endured years of uncertainty now allowed themselves limited optimism. The war appeared winnable. Effort seemed justified. The future, though still unclear, felt reachable again. British leadership interpreted progress as confirmation. Restructuring appeared effective. Centralized command delivered results. Increased pressure produced compliance and success. From London's perspective, the lesson was straightforward. Authority worked. This interpretation hardened quickly. Officials credited discipline, hierarchy, and imperial control for renewed momentum. Colonial participation was seen as response to direction rather than contribution shaped by local sacrifice. Colonists experienced the same progress differently. They acknowledged improvement, but they also recognized its cost. Gains were achieved through heavier taxation, deeper debt, longer service, and sustained disruption. Success did not erase strain, it confirmed it. For frontier communities, progress brought mixed relief. Victories reduced immediate threat in some areas. Yet campaigns intensified retaliation elsewhere. Movement brought exposure as much as protection. Security remained uneven. Families measured progress cautiously. They welcomed reduced danger, but remained wary of sudden reversal. Experience had taught them not to assume stability prematurely. In interior regions, progress changed conversation. People spoke less about delay and more about endurance paying off. Hope returned in measured form. Sacrifice felt validated, though still heavy. Economic consequences became clearer. Military success accelerated demand. Supply networks expanded. Contracts multiplied. Labor shortages persisted. Prices rose. War-driven growth benefited some while burdening others. This uneven benefit sharpened awareness of inequality. Those prospering from success viewed cost as investment. Those struggling viewed it as extraction. Progress intensified disparity rather than smoothing it. Colonial assemblies faced renewed complexity. Success strengthened arguments for continued support. It also intensified debate about limits. If victory was approaching, how much more should be given? If restructuring worked, why had it taken so long? These questions remained internal. They did not challenge authority openly. They questioned management, timing, and fairness. British officials did not always perceive this nuance. They saw progress and assumed acceptance. Compliance appeared to confirm legitimacy. Debate was dismissed as noise rather than signal. This misreading mattered. It encouraged further reliance on pressure rather than partnership. Centralization appeared validated by results. Military command continued to tighten. Orders were clearer, expectations higher. Local adaptation was increasingly constrained. Initiative was valued when it aligned with central planning, discouraged otherwise. Colonial leaders felt this narrowing. They remained committed to success but resented exclusion from decision-making. Local knowledge was still undervalued. Authority felt distant even when effective. Indigenous nations faced intensified consequence. Progress narrowed options. British success reduced bargaining power. Autonomy shrank. Pressure increased. Some indigenous leaders adapted strategically, seeking accommodation under new conditions. Others resisted, seeing renewed campaigns as existential threat. European commanders often treated resistance as obstruction rather than response. Violence intensified. Displacement spread. Long-term consequence was rarely considered amid pursuit of advantage. Religion adapted again. Clergy framed progress as providential reward for endurance. Sacrifice was now portrayed as validated by success. This message reinforced morale and obedience, yet belief remained cautious. Years of uncertainty had tempered optimism. People welcomed progress but withheld full confidence. Experience had taught restraint. Families continued to plan defensively. They prepared for continued absence. They saved cautiously. They delayed major decisions. Life remained provisional, even as hope returned. This provisional mindset shaped identity. Colonists increasingly saw themselves as contributors to imperial success rather than passive dependence. This shift did not produce rebellion, it produced expectation. If contribution mattered, recognition should follow. If sacrifice produced victory, relief should come. These expectations were not yet articulated as demands. They existed as assumptions. British officials formed assumptions of their own. They believed success justified authority. Control appeared necessary and effective. Colonial autonomy appeared secondary to imperial efficiency. These beliefs hardened as momentum continued. By late 1758, the war had entered a new phase. It was no longer stalled. It was no longer drifting. It was advancing, at cost. Progress restored confidence without restoring ease. It validated sacrifice while intensifying pressure. It delivered results while sharpening consequence. The colonies remained loyal. They remained committed. But their experience of success differed from imperial interpretation. For Britain, progress confirmed control. For the colonies, progress confirmed contribution. That difference would matter, because once success is achieved, questions follow. Who paid for it? Who shaped it? And who would decide what came next? Those questions were not yet asked aloud, but they were forming, quietly, persistently. As progress continued, so did consequence. And consequence, once felt, does not fade with victory. By the end of 1758, belief had shifted again, not toward rebellion, but toward expectation. For the first time since the war began, many colonists believed victory was possible. The renewed pressure and restructuring had produced results, and those results mattered psychologically. Momentum restored confidence that sacrifice was not endless, and that effort might finally lead to resolution. But this belief was conditional. People no longer believed success would come without cost, nor that sacrifice would quietly disappear once the war ended. Experience had reshaped expectation. Victory was imagined as an achievement earned through contribution, not granted through loyalty alone. This distinction marked an important change. Earlier in the war, sacrifice was framed as duty owed to empire. By late 1758, sacrifice was increasingly understood as investment. Colonists had given time, labor, money, and stability. They now expected that contribution to matter. Colonial assemblies reflected this belief. They continued to support the war, but discussions increasingly included questions about aftermath. How would debt be managed? Would taxes be reduced? Would authority relax? These questions did not challenge legitimacy, but they assumed adjustment. Compliance continued, but it was no longer passive. Participation was informed by calculation rather than optimism. Colonists believed the war was moving toward conclusion, and they believed that conclusion should bring change. British officials interpreted belief differently. They viewed success as confirmation of imperial strategy. Centralization appeared effective. Pressure appeared justified. The conclusion drawn in London was that authority, not negotiation, had produced results. This belief hardened. Officials increasingly assumed that post-war governance would require continued control to preserve stability and prevent future conflict. Autonomy appeared less necessary, even risky. Colonists were not aware of the full extent of this assumption. They still believed relief would follow victory. They assumed sacrifices made during war would be balanced by restoration afterward. This assumption preserved trust. Religion reinforced this belief. Clergy framed success as providential reward. Endurance had been tested, and progress was presented as validation. The message emphasized patience and continued obedience through the war's final stages. Faith stabilized expectation. Families responded with cautious hope. They planned tentatively for peace. They imagined return of absent labor. They anticipated reduced burden. These plans were not yet concrete, but they were forming. Life remained constrained, but optimism re-entered conversation. Indigenous nations held far less optimism. British success narrowed options. Autonomy diminished. Victory for one empire meant loss for others. Belief shifted towards survival under dominance rather than negotiation between powers. This divergence in belief would shape future conflict. By year's end, no unified interpretation existed. Colonists believed the war was nearing resolution and that contribution would be recognized. British officials believed success justified continued authority. Indigenous communities believed pressure would persist regardless of outcome. These beliefs coexisted uneasily. They did not yet collide. But they were incompatible. The war had not yet ended. But belief had moved ahead of outcome. Colonists imagined a post-war future shaped by restoration and recognition. British leaders imagined a post-war order shaped by control and prevention. Neither side articulated these visions openly. They remained assumptions. And assumptions, when unexamined, become sources of conflict. By the close of 1758, loyalty remained intact. Confidence had returned cautiously. Expectation had sharpened. The empire still held. But belief was no longer simple. It had become conditional. Conditional on outcome. Conditional on recognition. Conditional on change. Those conditions would soon matter. Because when victory arrives, belief is tested not by promise, but by response. And response, when it fails to meet expectation, reshapes history.